It began with a whisper, but within hours, the halls of Buckingham Palace were trembling. Camilla, once crowned Queen Consort, issued a directive that would normally go unquestioned. But what happened next shattered centuries of royal obedience. For the first time in modern monarchy, senior royal household staff did the unthinkable. They said no. And what's more chilling? It wasn't just about the order, it was about who Camilla had become. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The shift had been subtle at first. Camilla's posture in meetings, her tone with staff, her preference for being informed before decisions were even floated to the king, all of it suggested a growing dominance behind palace doors. It didn't happen overnight. Over months, her confidence had turned to control, and that control slowly shifted into command. Many staff members, especially those who had served the late queen, began to feel a creeping sense of discomfort. The traditions they had safeguarded for decades were now being reshaped quietly, forcefully under Camilla's tightening grip. And then, one particular directive pushed everything over the edge. The details of that order, once locked in the hush of royal discretion, finally surfaced in whispers among the highest-ranking aides. Camilla had allegedly demanded a reorganization of internal security assignments, essentially transferring oversight of certain royal apartments and sensitive communications from long-trusted staff to newer, hand-picked individuals reportedly loyal to her. It wasn't just operational. It was symbolic. And the symbolism was not lost on the people who had served the monarchy longer than Camilla had been welcomed into it. The message was clear: a shift in power was no longer approaching. It had arrived. But for some, this was one shift too far. In the confines of a rarely used meeting room, several senior officials, those with decades of service, gathered not to plot, but to question. Was it still loyalty if compliance meant betraying the very institution they swore to uphold? Was Camilla's authority absolute, or was there a line, sacred and unspoken, that should not be crossed? The mood was not rebellious. It was somber, heavy, bound by duty, not anger. And yet, the conclusion they reached marked the beginning of a rebellion no one had anticipated. They decided quietly, resolutely, not to carry out Camilla's directive. The ripples were immediate. Word of this refusal slipped through corridors and kitchens, past footmen and drivers, into the ears of security personnel and senior advisors. There was no shouting, no grand confrontation, but a tension began to choke the palace air. Doors closed faster. Conversations cut shorter. Camilla felt it, and when she summoned those responsible, demanding an explanation, she was met not with insubordination, but with something far more chilling: calm defiance. With firm, unwavering voices, they told her the directive had been reviewed and would not be enforced, in the interest of protecting long-standing protocol and the stability of the royal household. Camilla's fury was private, but palpable. Her inner circle noted her tightened tone, her sudden schedule changes, the cancellation of a private dinner she had planned with Charles that evening. The Queen Consort had been challenged not by the public, not by politicians, but by those within the palace walls she believed she had command over. This wasn't a leak. This wasn't a scandal exposed by the press. This was internal, intimate, and devastating. But the most dangerous part was that this wasn't an isolated event. It wasn't a flare of resistance doomed to flicker out. It was the beginning of something deeper. Older loyalties were waking up, and beneath Camilla's crown, the weight of the past was stirring. Her authority had been questioned, not by rivals, but by the very hands that upheld the monarchy's daily order. And this act of refusal, silent, measured, and collective, was the first true shot in a revolt that had been years in the making. But behind the household's defiance was a storm years in the making, and it was now erupting in full force, threatening to bring the royal machinery to its knees. As King Charles's health quietly declined, a new center of power emerged inside the palace, and it bore Camilla's unmistakable signature. From secret alliances to whispered meetings, insiders now speak of a shadow cabinet loyal not to the crown, but to the Queen Consort herself. But how far was Camilla willing to go to claim control? And who within the palace warned this would backfire? It started in corridors the public never sees. Camilla, cloaked in the privilege of her new status, began meeting discreetly with a tight circle of staffers, individuals who owed their positions not to royal lineage, but to her personal elevation. These weren't the usual palace strategists. They were loyalists, some former aides from her pre-coronation days, others newly appointed. Their allegiance untested but promising. What united them wasn't history or hierarchy. It was Camilla's vision. A monarchy no longer bound by outdated traditions but streamlined, rebranded, and molded under her watchful eye. They called it modernization. Others called it a quiet coup. At first, these gatherings were dismissed as harmless consultations. But then, long-standing advisors to the king began to notice a shift. Memos were bypassed. Decisions made without prior review. Invitations issued and rescinded often within hours. And most disturbing of all, voices that had once carried weight, those of Queen Elizabeth's most trusted staff, were now being quietly pushed aside. Retirements were announced with little ceremony. Roles were restructured, responsibilities redistributed. And in every case, the fingerprints of Camilla's emerging circle were visible, if one looked closely enough. Camilla, sources claimed, had grown tired of what she saw as an archaic machine. She was determined to pull the monarchy into the present, and to do that, she needed people who wouldn't question her. Those who did? Silenced, marginalized, forgotten. And the deeper she embedded herself into palace operations, the more speculation grew. Was this ambition, or something far more calculated? Whispers floated through the palace that the Queen Consort was quietly laying the groundwork for eventual control, knowing Charles's health was becoming less predictable. And the line between spouse and sovereign was already blurring behind closed doors. But not everyone remained silent. Princess Anne, whose loyalty to the crown had never wavered, was the first to notice the internal fractures. She voiced concern not publicly, but in carefully chosen words during private briefings. William, too, was watching. While still respectful of Camilla in public, he had begun to question decisions that bypassed traditional protocol. His meetings with longtime aides grew longer. His presence in administrative discussions increased. Something was changing. And while neither he nor Anne had yet moved against Camilla directly, their awareness marked the beginning of a quiet resistance. This wasn't an explosion, it was erosion. A slow, silent crumbling of the internal order. The revolt hadn't begun with a shout. It began with a whisper. Behind velvet doors, through narrowed eyes, in the spaces between Camilla's calculated plans and the institution's rigid past. For every move she made, 100 glances were exchanged, a dozen warnings buried beneath polite expressions. And though Camilla believed herself to be building a new foundation, others saw only cracks and knew they'd widen with time. And while Camilla believed she was tightening her grip, a different power was beginning to rise within the palace, one that would challenge her authority like never before. She is the iron spine of the monarchy. He is the heir with his father's restraint and his mother's fire. Together, Princess Anne and Prince William formed an unspoken alliance driven not by ambition, but by fear. Fear that Camilla's growing influence would fracture the very foundation of the crown. But what they discovered about her behind closed doors left them stunned. Anne had always been known for her unwavering discipline, her no-nonsense demeanor, and her unshakable loyalty to the crown. But when invitations began arriving with Camilla's monogram, rather than the sovereign seal, Anne quietly began to retreat. She declined key appearances, skipped committee meetings that had been restructured by Camilla's advisors, and avoided any event where her presence might be interpreted as approval. Her absence was never announced, but it was felt. And that absence wasn't just protocol. It was protest. It was Anne, in her silent and steadfast way, declaring that something was deeply wrong. William, meanwhile, was locked in a far more torturous struggle. He loved his father. He had tried for years to support Camilla publicly, despite the ghosts of the past that never truly left him. But now, as whispers turned into testimonies, and testimonies into troubling reports, he found himself torn between two sacred duties: protecting his father's peace and protecting the monarchy's future. The tension ate at him. His meetings with royal aides became longer, his questions more pointed, and in private he began requesting access to decisions Camilla had made, decisions, it seemed, that never passed through his father's desk at all. Anne and William did not conspire in the traditional sense. There were no late-night plotting sessions, no secret papers exchanged. But their movements began to echo one another. Anne made quiet inquiries to longtime palace veterans who had been removed, reassigned, or demoted in recent months, those who had served loyally under Queen Elizabeth and now found themselves cast aside. William reviewed appointment records and policy drafts that bore Camilla's influence, but lacked royal endorsement. The more they uncovered, the more urgent their concerns became. Camilla was not just asserting herself, she was redrawing the lines of power, and neither Anne nor William had signed off. Behind closed doors, the conversations grew more serious. Could Camilla be stopped? Had the king become too detached, too tired, or too loyal to see what was unfolding beneath him? William stopped short of confronting his father, but his questions became more direct. Anne, too, stopped holding her tongue in high-level meetings. The tension could no longer be contained in whispers. Even those loyal to Charles began to admit something in the palace had shifted, and not for the better. They did not speak publicly. They did not go to the press. But their quiet refusal to accept Camilla's unchecked influence was spreading. Staff began to align behind them. Advisors grew emboldened. Old alliances were reignited. And slowly, Camilla began to feel the temperature change. The Queen Consort, once so certain in her authority, now faced a wall of silence where there had once been obedience. Something had broken, and neither Anne nor William would move to fix it. Not this time. And then came the moment no one expected when defiance turned into open rebellion, and the royal household made their stand. They said it was just a scheduling conflict. They said it was a clerical error. But insiders now confirm, the night of the royal banquet, Camilla's instructions were flat out ignored. Entire departments refused to execute her directives, and when she confronted them, what she heard in response sent shockwaves across the monarchy and left Camilla visibly shaken. The evening had been meticulously planned until it wasn't. Just hours before the banquet was to begin, Camilla issued an unexpected reshuffle. She demanded that seating arrangements be altered, removing certain senior royals from their original positions and elevating newly favored allies to more prominent placements. The menu was changed without consulting the household chef. Media access was restricted, and security details were reassigned at her personal instruction. No explanation. No discussion. Only orders. But what she failed to anticipate was that this time, the staff would not follow. Led by one of the longest-serving aides from Queen Elizabeth's inner circle, a man whose word once shaped the palace's most sensitive operations, the senior staff stood together, in quiet but deliberate defiance. They did not issue statements. They didn't need to. They simply refused to act. When Camilla demanded an update on the revised arrangements, she was met with silence. When she pressed further, she was told politely, but firmly, that the original plans would proceed, that the crown's traditions would not bend to last-minute whims, that their loyalty was to the institution, not to the individual wearing the crown. Camilla's fury was immediate. She stormed into the East Wing, where senior household officials had gathered, expecting to confront disorganization. Instead, she found unity. In that room, surrounded by advisors who had once knelt before her, she was given no compromise. One by one, the officials explained their reasoning, not with rebellion in their tone, but with unshakable calm. They cited protocol. They cited precedents. But beneath every word, the message was clear: her authority was being questioned, and not in whispers anymore. The standoff didn't end with her words. It ended with hers being overruled. Word of the confrontation raced through the palace. By morning, it had reached the king. But Charles, perhaps too ill or too weary of the war beneath his own roof, said nothing. No reprimand. No defense. Just silence. And in that silence, Camilla heard something louder than any public statement. Isolation. Some staff, fearing fallout, offered resignations. But before they could be processed, William intervened. He met privately with the most senior among them and reassured them of their value to the monarchy. Not Camilla's monarchy, the monarchy. He asked them to stay, to hold the line. And in doing so, he made a statement louder than any speech. The Queen Consort may have issued the order, but the palace had answered with something far more powerful: no. That night, Camilla realized the harshest truth yet. She might wear the crown, She might speak in the king's name, but the foundation of the royal household, the spine of its machinery, no longer moved at her command. Respect, once grudgingly earned, had been quietly withdrawn. And for the first time, fear crept in. Not of losing status, but of realizing she never truly had control at all. As the dust settled that night, Camilla may have expected a quiet surrender. But what came next would push her into uncharted territory and spark a series of desperate moves. She would not be humiliated. Not again. Within hours of the revolt, Camilla called upon her closest allies, demanding loyalty, action, and retribution. Suddenly, staff who resisted found themselves reassigned, silenced, or worse, removed. But the more she tightened her grip, the faster her authority slipped away. The morning after the banquet revolt, Camilla's tone changed. No longer quiet, no longer diplomatic now, it was surgical. Names were whispered into private channels, files were reviewed behind locked doors, and within a day, several long-serving members of the royal household were informed of abrupt reassignments, some to distant estates, others relieved of duties altogether. The official explanation was restructuring, but behind the polished words lay a purge. Every removal had one thing in common, a traceable link to the act of defiance. It was revenge, cloaked in protocol. Whispers of surveillance followed. Camilla, determined to find the roots of dissent, allegedly ordered heightened monitoring of internal communications. Staff noticed emails being screened more heavily. Conversations were reported. Even informal chats were repeated back to individuals by people they hadn't spoken to. The palace became a place of fear not from outside threats, but from within. A divide grew between those loyal to Camilla's inner circle and those silently aligning with Anne and William. The household was no longer a machine. It was a battleground. In a desperate move to reassert control, Camilla sought an audience with Charles. Behind gilded doors, far from prying ears, she laid everything bare. She demanded action, not requests, not suggestions. She wanted names removed, roles revoked, support declared. But Charles, sitting in a quiet haze of uncertainty and fatigue, offered her a response so cold it chilled the very air around her. Let it pass. Those three words didn't just dismiss the revolt, they dismissed her. In that moment, Camilla understood that Charles's silence was no longer passive. It was permission for others to ignore her, for the palace to move without her. The impact shattered her. Behind closed doors, aides reported an emotional unraveling. Camilla, once a master of royal poise, now retreated into isolation. Her scheduled appearances were quietly cancelled. Her closest confidantes found themselves dealing with a woman wounded not by scandal, but by rejection. Not from the press, but from her own palace. Even those she had trusted began to step back. Her power, once quietly assumed, had now become painfully hollow. But the cruelest twist? Her attempts to consolidate power didn't suppress rebellion, they sparked it further. And this time, the resistance wasn't led by distant staff or whispered alliances. It came from blood. From within the very royal family she believed she had finally conquered. Because her grasp for control had crossed a line, and what came next wasn't just pushback, it was a reckoning. And as Camilla scrambled to salvage her reign within the palace walls, another blow was already coming, one she never expected, from the king himself. The man at the center of it all said nothing. No orders, no reprimands, not even a whisper of support for the Queen Consort. To some it was a calculated strategy, to others it was a quiet betrayal. But one thing was certain, Charles's silence spoke volumes. And behind that silence, a storm was gathering. From the moment the revolt erupted, every eye turned toward the king. This was his household, his reign, his wife. And yet, as chaos rippled through the palace, Charles remained curiously absent from the battlefield. Meetings were held without him. Decisions were delayed without explanation. When asked directly about Camilla's authority, he offered polite deflections, careful smiles, and nothing more. To the outside world, it appeared dignified restraint. Inside the palace, it felt like abandonment. Insiders began to notice the change in him almost immediately. Once attentive and precise, Charles now drifted through briefings as if burdened by thoughts he refused to share. His gaze lingered too long on windows. His responses grew slower, softer, strangely detached. Some whispered that illness had dulled his strength. Others believed something far more complex was unfolding, that Charles was trapped between two forces, tearing him apart. Loyalty to the woman he had fought decades to marry, and loyalty to the legacy he had waited a lifetime to inherit. The pressure reached Camilla quickly. Desperate to regain control, she sought private meetings with Charles, sometimes late into the night. Behind closed doors, sources claimed, her composure fractured. She pleaded not as queen, but as wife. She warned him that without his support her authority would collapse, that the palace was slipping from their grasp, that William and Anne were gaining ground. But Charles offered only ambiguity. He nodded, he listened, and then he said nothing. No commands issued, no defenses mounted, just distance, just silence. And then came the whispers that changed everything. Reports emerged suggesting Charles may not have been surprised by the revolt at all, that he had heard the warnings weeks earlier, that he had been told which staff were preparing to resist and which royals were quietly aligning against Camilla. Some even claimed he had allowed it to happen, believing the household needed to correct itself without his hand forcing the outcome. If true, it meant something chilling. The king had chosen not to protect his queen consort. He had chosen the crown. That silence did more than wound Camilla. It empowered the resistance. Staff read it as permission. Anne interpreted it as approval. William saw it as an opening. Without Charles stepping in, the balance of power shifted almost overnight. Camilla's orders lost weight. Her meetings grew shorter. Her circle thinned. Meanwhile, the palace began to reorganize itself quietly, instinctively, around a new center of gravity, one no longer anchored to the Queen Consort. Charles, still publicly calm, had become the most dangerous figure in the room precisely because he refused to act. In his stillness, alliances were forming. In his quiet, futures were being decided. And while Camilla waited for a word that never came, the monarchy began to move forward without her at its center. But even as Charles remained quiet, another royal prepared to make a thunderous move, one that would change the palace power dynamic overnight. It was never meant for public eyes. A letter, penned in William's unmistakable hand, delivered quietly to the staff who had risked everything. But once its words were whispered through the corridors, everything changed. It wasn't just a message, it was a reckoning. The letter arrived without ceremony. It didn't bear the official seal, nor was it announced with a formal signature from Clarence House. Instead, it was slipped into the hands of a senior aide, who had stood at the heart of the revolt and refused to obey Camilla's directives. No press, no photos, just ink and intent. William had chosen his moment carefully, and the message was both subtle and seismic. In calm yet resolute language, he extended gratitude to the household staff who had, in his words, stood firm in defense of the crown's enduring values. He praised their composure under pressure and acknowledged the unspoken cost of their loyalty to something greater than rank or title, loyalty to legacy. But it wasn't all gratitude. Beneath the warmth, there was weight. William expressed his unease about what he described as unconventional reorientations in the palace's internal structure, an unmistakable reference to Camilla's aggressive reshaping of royal power. He didn't name her, but he didn't need to. Every recipient of the letter knew exactly who he meant, and the moment the letter was read aloud behind closed doors, a new fire sparked within the staff. The heir to the throne had just taken a side, and it wasn't hers. The mood shifted almost immediately. Those who had felt unsure, anxious, and even afraid found new strength in William's words. For the first time since the rebellion began, it wasn't just resistance, it was righteous. Empowered by the future king's backing, household staff carried themselves with quiet defiance. They began reasserting traditional protocols, reinstating previously dismissed procedures, and openly coordinating with Anne's camp, knowing now they were protected. And Anne herself, upon reading the letter, offered William a few simple words that would echo throughout the palace. "You've done what needed to be done." The letter might have remained a quiet secret had it not been for one unexpected leak. A royal biographer with known connections to the household received an anonymous copy. Within days, Carefully chosen excerpts appeared in the press. Though William refused to comment publicly, the effect was immediate. The narrative shifted. No longer was the Queen Consort seen as an uncontested authority. The public now saw a palace divided and a prince preparing to lead. The leak was a revelation and a warning. It confirmed what many had only suspected: the monarchy was undergoing a silent war. And William was no longer content to watch from the sidelines. His words, never meant for the world, had found it anyway, and once released, they couldn't be taken back. Camilla, still reeling from Charles's silence, now had to face the realization that William was no longer an ally of convenience. He was a force of restoration, and he had just taken his first public step. And just when the palace appeared to stabilize, an explosive twist shattered any illusion of peace, a betrayal hidden in plain sight. In the depths of the revolt, a buried secret came to light: a deal made by Camilla long before the coronation. A deal that, once uncovered, exposed a hidden betrayal not just of tradition, but of the king himself. When Charles found out, everything between them fractured, possibly forever. The discovery began as a whisper, unearthed by a junior financial officer combing through archived communications tied to future royal engagement budgets. What started as a routine audit quickly turned into a revelation. Tucked inside a seemingly mundane file was a document bearing Camilla's signature, an agreement forged between her and a network of private consultants months before her formal elevation. The contents of the deal stunned those who read it. Camilla had allegedly promised external advisors an unprecedented level of control over the planning, management, and monetization of select royal engagements and charitable endeavors, control that traditionally fell within the sovereign's discretion. She had signed away pieces of the monarchy's public face for strategic gain, all under the justification of efficiency and modern relevance. But the timing made it impossible to ignore. This agreement had been made before Charles had officially handed over more public duties, and without his direct knowledge. Worse, several of the engagements in question overlapped with legacy projects dear to the late Queen, ones that William and Anne had fought to preserve. When the proof landed on William's desk, it wasn't just paperwork. It was betrayal. He brought it to Anne, who immediately grasped the weight of what had been uncovered. Together, they decided this couldn't be buried. Not this time. Not when the very essence of the crown had been bartered for power. Their confrontation with Charles was quiet, but seismic. In a closed-door meeting that lasted less than an hour, they presented him with the documents, detailing what Camilla had orchestrated behind his back. Witnesses described the king's expression as one of pure devastation. He asked for silence, read every line, and then said nothing. The betrayal was not just professional, it was deeply personal. Camilla, the woman he had sacrificed his reputation to love, had made a deal that undercut his sovereignty. He had given her the crown, and she had sold pieces of it before ever wearing it. Camilla, when summoned, was shaken. She tried to explain, insisting that the arrangement was misunderstood, that it was a safeguard for the monarchy's long-term survival, that it wasn't about power, but preservation. She said she feared the institution would crumble without adaptation, and this deal was simply a proactive measure. But Charles wasn't moved by her defense. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He simply stood, walked to the window, and gave his response with a chilling finality: "You did this without me." Those 6 words landed like a gavel, delivering a judgment not only on the deal, but on their entire foundation. Camilla left that room alone, and in tears. For the first time since the beginning of her rise, she understood what it meant to be cast out not by the public, not by the press, but by the man who had made her queen. The man who had once defended her at all costs now stood silently at the center of a monarchy she could no longer touch. Now, with the monarchy on edge and Camilla's influence spiraling, the question loomed large across every palace corridor: what comes next? The revolt is over, but the scars remain. Camilla's orders no longer carry the same weight. William steps forward with quiet confidence. Anne moves with renewed purpose. And Charles, once seen as passive, now watches from the shadows. But the real question echoes from every marble wall. In this new order, who truly holds the power? In the wake of the revelations and ruptures, Camilla's presence inside the palace began to fade. There was no grand announcement, no formal abdication of role, just a soft retreat, marked by a statement citing the need for health and space. But the absence was unmistakable. Her once frequent meetings became rare. Her inner circle dwindled. Those who had rallied behind her during her rise now kept their distance, slipping into silence or exiting the palace altogether. Without confrontation, without ceremony, Camilla had been quietly, unmistakably sidelined. And in her absence, a new structure emerged, not officially, not publicly, but undeniably. William began to take on duties that exceeded his title. Invitations once addressed to the king or queen consort were now redirected to him. Palace correspondence began reflecting his voice, his tone, his vision. Staff felt the difference instantly. Gone was the tension, the fear of speaking out of turn. In its place came clarity, confidence, and a sense of direction the institution had been starving for. William, without proclamation, had begun to lead. Anne moved just as swiftly, though less visibly. She became the steady hand behind William's emergence, providing counsel, continuity, and a kind of moral backbone the palace hadn't felt since Queen Elizabeth's final years. Together, William and Anne established a rhythm, a new energy that respected tradition, but wasn't bound by it. Staff who had once whispered in fear now worked with pride. Their morale wasn't restored by decree, but by recognition. They felt seen, heard, valued. And for the first time in months, perhaps years, the monarchy began to breathe again. Charles remained present, but distantly so. His public appearances were sparse, his speeches carefully worded. He allowed William to step forward while remaining behind the curtain, making strategic decisions without engaging in the daily storm. Whether by design or exhaustion, he had chosen to rule from the shadows. And in doing so, he gave his son the space to become what the institution needed most: a stabilizing force in the aftermath of chaos. Behind closed doors, the new reality set in. Camilla's influence, once vast, had collapsed into a quiet corner of royal history. Her legacy, though not erased, would be stained by the revolt she could neither suppress nor survive. The palace had shifted. The walls were the same, the titles unchanged, but the spirit inside them had transformed. Power no longer belonged to a crown alone. It belonged to those who had earned it through fire. And as the monarchy pushes forward under a new, unspoken rule, one thing is certain: the revolt may be over, but its impact will echo for generations. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.